Winter arrived quietly that year, not with dramatic snowfall or postcard perfection, but with a cold that settled deep in the bones and refused to leave. The city dressed itself for the season anyway, stringing up Christmas lights that glowed gold against the early darkness, hopeful and almost forgiving. Shop windows shimmered with promise. Streets hummed with soft music and hurried footsteps. From the outside, everything suggested warmth, reunion, renewal. Inside James, however, nothing felt complete. For years, he had learned to survive by building defenses, careful, deliberate, and thick. Silence was safer than honesty. Distance felt more reliable than vulnerability. Life, as he had come to understand it, rewarded endurance, not surrender. Strength meant holding your ground, absorbing the weight, never letting cracks show. Or so he believed. It was on one of those unremarkable December evenings, when the sky darkened far too early and the air carried the faint scent of roasted chestnuts from a street corner, that James found himself standing outside Deep's door. He wasn't entirely sure why he had come. Perhaps it was the loneliness that always seemed to grow louder in December. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Or perhaps it was the simple truth he rarely admitted to himself: no one else ever saw him the way she did. Deep opened the door without surprise, as though she had been expecting him all along. Warm light spilled out behind her, carrying with it the comforting smells of simmering soup and freshly washed rice. It wasn't the warmth of luxury or abundance, but the quiet warmth of care, the kind that comes from attention, from effort, from presence. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not awkward or heavy. It was familiar. "You look tired," Deep said softly. The words landed gently, without accusation or demand. James attempted a smile, but it faltered halfway. He stepped inside, and the door closed behind him, shutting out the cold, the noise, and the relentless world that always seemed to expect more than he could give. When Deep wrapped her arms around him, it wasn't planned. It was instinctive, a simple, human reaction. And yet, in that brief embrace, something inside James finally gave way. His shoulders loosened. His breath slowed. The defenses he had carried for so long, pride, anger, control, began to fall away, one by one. In her arms, he didn't need to explain his failures. He didn't need to justify his pain or prove his strength. He wasn't required to perform resilience or confidence. He was simply allowed to be human. Outside, Christmas music drifted faintly through the window, a reminder that the season was meant for togetherness, for shared moments rather than solitary endurance. Deep guided him to the small table by the window, where 2 cups of tea steamed quietly. Beyond the glass, the city continued its restless rush. Inside the room, time seemed to soften. As they sat together, James wondered, perhaps for the first time in years, what it might feel like to face Christmas without Armour. To wake without fear. To believe that happiness, however fragile, was still possible. Deep smiled at him, gentle, patient, and the question lingered in the air like falling snow. Was this the beginning of a happy first Christmas together, or merely a pause before the next storm? Morning arrived wrapped in pale winter light, the kind that slips quietly through curtains and wakes the world without asking permission. James hadn't slept deeply, yet he woke with an unfamiliar sense of calm. For once, his mind wasn't racing ahead to unfinished plans or unresolved conflicts. Instead, he listened. The soft clatter of dishes in the kitchen. The muted sounds of a city preparing for another December day. Deep moved through the small space with gentle purpose, humming a tune James didn't recognize. It wasn't a Christmas carol, just an ordinary melody, but it filled the room with life. She handed him a cup of coffee, still hot. "Drink it before it cools," she said. It was a small thing. Ordinary, even. And yet it carried an intimacy he had almost forgotten, someone noticing, someone caring, without needing to be asked. Outside, Christmas decorations lined the streets. Shop windows glowed as if happiness could be bought, wrapped in red paper, and carried home. James watched people pass by. Parents holding children's hands, couples laughing over shared secrets, strangers rushing home with bags of gifts. From a distance, it all looked so simple. He knew better. He knew how many silent struggles walked beneath those lights. How many smiles concealed private battles. In that sense, his story and Deep's felt painfully familiar, like countless lives lived quietly between hope and fear. Later that afternoon, they stepped into the cold together. The air was sharp, biting. Deep's scarf brushed against James's arm as they walked, grounding him in the present. They moved slowly through the market, past pine branches, dried oranges, and handmade ornaments. Deep paused to examine each one, her eyes lighting up with childlike wonder. Watching her, James realized how long it had been since he allowed himself to notice beauty without suspicion. How often he had braced himself for disappointment rather than letting joy arrive unguarded. The calm, however, did not last. As evening approached, James's phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from his father, short, precise, heavy with unspoken authority. The past, it seemed, had not agreed to stay behind. James's steps slowed. His jaw tightened. Deep noticed immediately. She didn't ask what the message said. She didn't demand explanations. Instead, she reached for his hand and squeezed it once, firm, steady, a quiet reminder that he was not alone in that moment, even if the road ahead remained uncertain. As Christmas lights flickered on above them, James felt the familiar pull between who he had been and who he wanted to become. Love had opened his defenses, but it had not erased the world's demands. The question was no longer whether happiness existed, but whether he was brave enough to choose it, knowing how easily it could be taken away. That evening, the city seemed to slow, as if holding its breath. Christmas Eve arrived without fireworks or celebration, but with a hush that settled into corners and hearts alike. In Deep's small living room, a modest Christmas tree stood by the window. It was decorated with simple lights and a handful of handmade ornaments, nothing extravagant, nothing staged. And yet it felt real, the way ordinary lives always are. James stared at the tree longer than necessary. Its fragile lights reflected in his eyes, trembling slightly, like his thoughts. The message from his father echoed in his mind. Authority had a way of lingering, even in silence. Old fears returned. Fear of disappointment, fear of disobedience, fear of choosing the wrong future. Love, he realized, did not erase fear. It simply forced one to face it. Deep noticed his distance. She set aside the dishes she had been washing and joined him by the window. "You don't have to tell me," she said gently. "But you don't have to carry it alone either." The words were simple, but they struck deeper than any accusation. James finally spoke, not in anger, not in defense, but in exhaustion. He told her about the expectations placed on him since childhood. About decisions made on his behalf. About how love, in his life, had always felt conditional. As he spoke, his voice wavered. The strongest walls, he realized, are often built to protect the most fragile truths. Deep listened without interrupting. When he finished, she didn't offer solutions or advice. She leaned her head against his shoulder. That quiet presence, free of judgment, became his refuge. Outside, laughter drifted up from the street. Somewhere, a family was celebrating. Somewhere else, another was breaking apart. Life, James thought, always moved in contrasts. Later, they sat beneath the tree, wrapping small gifts. Deep tied the ribbons carefully, as if every motion mattered. James struggled at first, clumsy, uncertain, until they laughed together softly, like children trying not to wake the house. In that laughter, something eased. For a moment, the weight of the world lifted. Yet beneath the warmth lingered a question neither dared to ask aloud. What happens after Christmas? Love could shelter them for a night, perhaps for a season. But could it withstand the choices waiting beyond the holiday glow? As the lights dimmed and midnight approached, James realized that happiness was no longer an abstract dream. It sat beside him, breathing quietly, asking not for perfection, but for courage. Christmas morning arrived without ceremony. No bells rang, no choir sang beneath the window. Instead, sunlight slipped gently through the curtains, touching the small room with a pale, honest warmth. Deep woke first. She moved softly, careful not to disturb James, who slept beside her on the sofa. His face was finally free of tension. For the first time in a long while, he looked like someone who had stopped fighting in his dreams. She watched him for a moment, her heart both full and heavy. Love, she knew, was never just about holding on. Sometimes it was about knowing when to let go. When James woke, the smell of warm coffee filled the room. Deep stood near the stove, humming faintly, her back turned. The sound was ordinary, almost mundane, and yet it stirred something deep inside him. In all his years of success and struggle, no boardroom, no luxury apartment had ever felt like this. They sat together at the small table, sharing a simple breakfast. Outside, children ran past laughing, their voices bright and careless. Christmas, James thought, belonged to moments like these, not grand promises, but quiet truths. He looked at Deep and finally asked the question that had lingered all night. Are you afraid? She met his gaze. Of course, she said honestly. I'm afraid every day. But I'm more afraid of living a life where I abandon what matters most. Her answer didn't push him. It didn't demand anything, and somehow, that was what gave it power. James stood and walked toward the window. His phone lay heavy in his pocket, filled with missed calls, unspoken ultimatums, and a future already planned by someone else. He knew that choosing Deep meant conflict, disappointment, and pain. But choosing silence meant losing himself, slowly, quietly, forever. He turned back. His decision trembled, but it was Ray.